Hej, Ivar Arpi här. Från och med nu är jag en del av Kvartal. Kul va? Det tycker jag i alla fall. Kanske lite oväntat, eller inte alls oväntat. Jag vet inte. Men nu är jag här i alla fall och jag har tagit med mig mina 2 poddar. För dig som följer Kvartal innebär det att du nu får ytterligare 2 poddavsnitt varje vecka. I podden Rak Höger med Ivar Arpi så intervjuar jag framträdande politiker, akademiker eller författare. Eller bara människor som är intressanta på något sätt. Och i podden Under all kritik som jag har ihop med Anna-Karin så slår vi både näven och handväskan i bordet om aktuella och rykande inaktuella händelser. Och båda poddarna utkommer som sagt en gång i veckan. För dig som ännu inte har blivit prenumerant antingen på Kvartal eller på min Substack Rak Höger så betyder det här att du nu kan få all min journalistik och hela resten av Kvartal med en enda prenumeration. Och just nu så får du första månaden helt gratis om du går till kvartal.se/testa Ivar. Gör det, tycker jag. Testa Ivar. För då kan du lyssna på hela avsnitten av mina 2 poddar, helt reklamfritt dessutom. Och så får du hela Kvartals växande utbud på köpet, inklusive alla poddar i fullversioner och utan reklam, som du kan höra direkt i Kvartals app eller i exempelvis Podcaster eller Spotify. Eller där du väljer att lyssna på din podd. Så gå till kvartal.se/testa Ivar för att testa det nya och växande Kvartal helt gratis första månaden. Tänk själv, som de säger här på Kvartal. Men gör som jag säger och testa Ivar. My guest today is Jussim, who's a distinguished professor of psychology at Rutgers University and one of social psychology's most persistent internal critics. And he's also a fellow Substacker, so go and check out his excellent publication Unsafe Science on Substack after the podcast. I highly recommend it. For decades, Jussim has challenged a powerful story inside his own field. Social psychology often treated stereotypes as false by definition, implicit bias as a hidden force explaining discrimination, and ordinary human judgment as something suspect, something experts had to diagnose and correct. Jussim's work points in the opposite direction. He argues that many demographic stereotypes are in fact statistically accurate, that this is one of the largest and most replicable findings in social psychology, and that the Implicit Association Test does not measure what its strongest proponents claimed it measured: hidden racism that reliably predicts discriminatory behavior. It doesn't show that at all. Ordinary people, in his telling, often read social reality far better than the discipline wanted to believe. In this conversation, we talk about stereotype accuracy, implicit bias, DEI, academic conformity, and what happens when a science built to study bias becomes blind to its own. It's an American debate, but not only an American one. Much of what Jussim describes is just as relevant to Swedish universities and research. Ideological consensus passing as expertise, fragile findings hardening into policy, and the difficulty of questioning either. But now on to today's guest. You're listening to Rak Höger with me, Ivar Arpi. Welcome, Jussim, to Rak.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
And I just I noticed you a few years back when I started reading Jonathan Haidt and Philip Tetlock, and you were like writing papers together with them. And when you first, sometimes I feel like when I first notice someone, I feel like they are new as well because I'm new to them. But then
I'm old. I'm old. Yeah, I'm totally old.
And then it turns out you're really old.
I'm old. I turned 70 this last year. I mean, I'm old.
Yeah. So you've been doing this, and then I started reading up on like what you've been up to even before I noticed what you've been writing and the interesting papers and books that you've been writing. And And you've been sort of some people start to become like a sore point in academia late in their careers, so that their colleagues get annoyed with them like later on. But I think that maybe
Yeah.
you've been annoying for decades
For
to your
decades.
colleagues.
Yeah.
So, like, when did you like biographically and intellectually, when did you start to realize that something was wrong within your own field of social psychology?
Probably the biggest turning point for me was started out interested in, and I'm still interested in, social stereotypes. That is, people's beliefs about groups, and especially how and whether those beliefs influence, bias, distort how they judge individuals from those groups. It's some of my earliest stuff in graduate school in the 80s was on that. Reading the literature on stereotypes was vividly clear at that time. And at that time, I'm not, not a gadfly at that point. I'm just doing, I want to understand how stereotypes and when stereotypes bias judgments of individuals, very conventional social psychological thing to be doing. So, but there's all this stuff on all these papers claiming that stereotypes are inaccurate. And at that time, I assumed they knew what they were talking about. Like, I was just a lowly graduate. Why would I not assume senior faculty writing in prestigious outlets declaring stereotypes are inaccurate would be wrong? Why, or wouldn't know what they were talking about? It wouldn't even occur to me. All I wanted to do at that point was to get to the bottom of those claims. So what's the original research finding that stereotypes are inaccurate and they lead to powerful and pervasive biases and judgments of individuals? Because those were the claims common in the 80s. And I go into the literature and I find what I ended up calling a black hole. And it was the black hole at the bottom of these declarations that stereotypes are inaccurate. So, and by black hole, what I mean is some large portion, half the claims that stereotypes are inaccurate didn't cite anything to support the claim. They just stated it. Like, it's like saying the sky is blue. You don't need a reference to declare the sky blue. You don't need a reference to declare stereotypes are inaccurate. But they don't seem like the same kinds of claims.
We hold these truths
to be self-evident. Yes, right, exactly.
Like in the declaration.
Right. Now, you could define stereotypes as inaccurate. Then, of course, they're inaccurate by definition. But that creates other problems, which you asked me how I got this. So let me hold off on that.
Yeah.
So there's all these articles declaring them inaccurate without a citation. Okay, I don't know what to do with that. But then maybe half the articles have a citation. So then I would go to that citation. I'd go to that article, the article being cited. And that article would declare stereotypes to be inaccurate without an empirical citation. And at the bottom of all this was nothing. There was no empirical evidence there, or almost no empirical evidence. So I first got in trouble, not in too much trouble yet, but a little bit of trouble for saying, well, if psychologists want to declare stereotypes to be inaccurate, they should get evidence on this. And that was like, that some people that pissed off. It's like, this is not the kind of thing you need evidence for, because I guess because it was self-evident. So then I and my several collaborators published stuff making conceptual arguments why stereotypes wouldn't necessarily always be inaccurate, and taking the field to task for making these claims without evidence, that if they want to make the claims, that's fine. They should just get some evidence that supports it. Okay, so I and others, they're actually before me, probably the first begin getting evidence on the accuracy of stereotypes was Clark Macaulay. And I think he may be retired now. He's like 10 years ahead of me, 15 years ahead of me. He's not no spring chicken at this point. He's got to be close to 80. I mean, he was publishing on this in 1978. In 1978, I had dropped in and out of undergrad. So in 78, I wasn't even in college. So he had a small number of studies on both sex and race stereotypes that found people were very, very accurate. That if you ask people, what they believe about, he would purposely choose criteria for which there were objective set, like census data. How many Black Americans have a high school degree? How many Black Americans are on public assistance? Yeah, these are things for which they're very clear data, strong data on. And if you would then ask people, what they think about, what's the proportion of Black Americans with high school diplomas? And people were very, very accurate. They were very, very accurate. They weren't perfectly accurate, but they were very, very accurate. You found the same thing with sex stereotypes. Again, this was all before I came along, or right maybe as I was beginning to become aware of this stuff. And that eventually triggered an outburst of research on the accuracy of stereotypes, not just by us. I continued to do some of it, so did he, but there was all sorts of stuff after that. For, starting maybe in the late 80s and early 90s into the 2000s, there were just scores of papers assessing the accuracy of all sorts of stereotypes. The basic demographic stereotypes, age, sex, race. But then, sometimes people found it useful to study these things kind of experimentally, so they'd use different kinds of groups. There were a series of studies on the accuracy of beliefs about sororities and fraternities. So that's good because the sororities and fraternities, the advantage of that is they're not involved in like social and political issues in the same way that race and sex might be. But it didn't really matter, completely 100%. Most of the time, most of these studies found at least moderate, sometimes very high accuracy in people's beliefs about groups. It was really kind of staggering. So much so that just within the last year, a meta-analysis came out of the accuracy of gender stereotypes that completely vindicated all that. It was by two women, both of whom have, kind of both strong social science, but also strong feminist credentials. The meta-analysis shows that gender stereotypes are moderately to highly accurate, but that was my first. So that was how I discovered, that's how I began to discover that my field was riddled with these dysfunctions. So by which I mean, you can't be in the business of making empirical claims without empirical data. Like, what the hell? What kind of scientific field? We claim to be a scientific field, and yet people are just making stuff up. So, and then I would say that more or less, I'm talking in sort of casual language now, but in academic papers, I would say essentially the same thing. So of course that pisses people off. And, the people in my field didn't want to hear that. So they doubly didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to hear that stereotypes had this high accuracy component. And they didn't want to hear me saying the field is a mess. So they didn't like either part of that. So that's how it began.
Like the stereotype accuracy, the notion that stereotypes or biases towards groups can be accurate. It sounds like provocation almost. It sounds like something like if you're in a sort of an argument in a pub or a bar. And then you have like a loud guy saying like, but it's right, it's right, correct, right? But the stereotype is correct.
Yeah.
It's not so simple what you are suggesting. No, could you go into a little bit more?
Yeah, it's not so simple. So first place, when I say the evidence finds that stereotypes are accurate, we're talking things like moderate to sometimes high correlations between people's beliefs and criteria. So moderate correlation might be 0.4, 0.5, which translating that to, someone who is not familiar with correlations might mean people's judgments are right maybe 70% of the time, something like that. Sometimes the correlations are higher, so the percentages would be higher. But 70% is like pretty good compared to like inaccurate, which is what I was arguing against. But it's far from perfect, even at 70%, which means to me, even though from a scientific standpoint, it is reasonable to say that in general, with some exceptions, stereotypes are at least moderately, sometimes pretty accurate. That doesn't mean any given person, including, a guy drinking a beer in a bar, should assume that his beliefs about particular groups are necessarily accurate. That actually would, they may be accurate. He may know what he's talking about, but that would require comparing his beliefs against some sort of evidence. And just you can't assume that just because this is generally true, that it's always true, or it's always true for any particular individual. You just can't assume that.
Hej, Ivar Arpi här. Jag ville bara passa på att tacka er som prenumererar på Rak Höger. Ni är faktiskt över 25 000 nu. Och utan er hade inget av det här varit möjligt. Det är endast tack vare er prenumeranter som jag kan vara helt självständig. Tillsammans så skapar vi det medielandskap som vi vill se. Men för att det ska fungera så behöver några av er som är gratisprenumeranter bli betalande prenumeranter. Och just nu så får ni 40% rabatt på prenumerationen. Gå då in på enrakhoger.se/podd för att ta del av erbjudandet. Alltså glöm inte att skriva enrakhoger.se/podd. Och nu fortsätter avsnittet. And like it seems like social psychology got, because I read sociology in the early noughts, and a lot of it like was about these things, of course, social psychology, and you get taught at university, and I would say in like the public discourse, at least in Sweden a lot, like check your biases.
Oh yeah.
And you have these like educational leaflets from the government or government agencies, like actively trying to work against the bias that they presume that people have.
Right.
And so it seems like both the science and the sort of the public discourse has been very invested in, like, you shouldn't be biased, and you shouldn't, and your biases are wrong. Like, and what your research seemed to suggest is that, at least in part, that might be morally correct in some way, but but why do you think, how does your research rhyme with the whole sort of progressive mission of like against anti-bias work?
Well, rhyme is I'm not sure that it does, although I'm not sure that it doesn't either. So as a moral statement, I completely agree with that. Yeah, it's bad in all sorts of ways to have biased judgments of other people. So it's certainly bad in high stakes contexts like college admissions or employment or something like that. And most of us are imperfect, and we are potentially vulnerable to all sorts of biases, not just stereotype biases. And so it does, for a person who understands that, I think it's useful to understand that we do have these, to really understand it, not as like okay, we all have biases, but now let's move on, that we do, and that in important contexts, there are things one can do to limit the effects of those, the potential effects. You may not even have these biases, but you don't really know. It's like one thing to conduct an experiment and you have 500 participants, and you can see that there's a difference in how these 250 versus this 100. But when you live your life, you're doing one thing at a time. You can't live your life as a controlled experiment. So it's very hard to know whether your own judgments are biases, but it's not really that hard to do things to limit your potential for bias, especially for things like college applications or work applications, evaluating people for jobs or promotions. There's no guarantee that any particular thing will eliminate bias, but there are things you can do to that have a very high potential. Those are mainly for things like college and work. It's focus on the merits and competence of the person. I mean, that's what you should be focusing on. Whether it doesn't matter whether they're a man or woman or what their race is. What should matter is how good they are at the job, or how good they are at the precursors to the job. If you're hiring an entry-level person or a college, and usually you either easily have those things at your fingertips, certainly for college admissions, and for most employment things, you're going to have a person's resume. So you can see what they've done. There's other ways you can also evaluate a person on their merits. If you focus on the things relevant to whatever the decision, the personnel selection type thing you're doing, then you're going to, again, there's no guarantee, but you're going to do everything you can to limit that potential. And that's, if you want to admit the best students, if you want to hire the best person, that's what you want to do. You want to focus on what they're capable of, not their demographic.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of, the whole discussion seems sort of lynches, or it sort of rests on an assumption that the biases are true, because a lot of the progressives, or what do you want to call them, they want to further groups that are disadvantaged, or whatever term you want to use. So that implies that they, like, many of these biases are correct.
Right.
So because if let's say African Americans, they're poorer, they're more prone to commit violent crime. If you have these kinds of, you make these social claims, but then as a progressive, you would say, yeah, but that's the reason we need these government programs.
Right.
That's the reason why we need affirmative action, or we need diversity training, and because that's the reason we do it. But you're not supposed to say the bias out loud. But the whole argument rests on it being true, basically.
Well, so I think, doing my best to channel the progressive view, which I'm probably not the best person to do that. they would.
That's the great interviewer who forces the interviewee to like channel the opposite view after 20 minutes. Yeah.
Right. I think many anyway, would argue that the discrepancies in the academic records of young Black people compared to others, right, Asians, whites, whatever, that itself stems from racism and bias in the system. And so, yes, those gaps, those differences, differences in high school degree, differences in GPA, differences in standardized test scores, they exist, but they exist because of racism. And so this treatment is merely compensation for the biases that already exist in the system. So it's not really, they would argue it's not real. Two things. I think they would dispute that there are genuine underlying differences in intellectual or academic capabilities or interests between groups or motivation other than those caused by racism, and that because those differences are inculcated by a racist system, social action, programmatic action is required not to provide advantages to Black applicants, but to compensate for the discriminatory disadvantages that they've had to face. I think that would be the argument.
So it's basically furthering meritocratic ideal,
right?
rather than
that's right.
It's impeding.
Right.
It's saving meritocracy.
It's like saving meritocracy. I think that would be the argument.
Yeah, I think speaking as a non-progressive, I think you nailed it. Yeah, I think this ties into another thing that you've been written about, and others as well, because one of the most influential ideas to come out of social psychology in recent times is the notion of implicit bias, and the claim that people, even though they reject prejudice, they still carry unconscious associations that shape their behavior, like that reinforces the system that we just talked about. It's like, I wrote about this like 10 years ago, I think, or something like that, in Svenska Dagbladet, which is a daily newspaper in Sweden. And I went through like the claims. I think I sort of probably referenced something you wrote. I don't remember. But like, okay, these are the claims, but they don't, it's very tenuous, and it's not clear if this is something that's really proven. The same day or the day after I published my essay, we had a mandatory course at the newspaper to teach us, all the journalists, and at least it was mandatory for the bosses, but it was highly recommended for everyone else to like have a core lecture about our implicit biases. And it was just it's so clear that there's like, you have one level, like in the public discourse, you can like discuss it, but you have another like within the HR departments, and it's just like rolling out. But I would like to ask you, like, what's your view on implicit bias and the science? Is it like, what are the claims, and how much like evidence is there for it?
Well, so the early claims, the workhorse method of assessing implicit bias is the IAT, the Implicit Association Test. So without going into all the technical details, that was first published in 1998. And so, it's been almost 30 years that this notion of implicit bias has been, pushed in the literature, and it really took off. There was a small and then growing cadre of people who thought this was a great method. So there was this outburst, this explosion of research using the IAT to assess implicit bias in the 2000s and the 2010s. That kind of research has a unique insulation from critique, from scientific critique. And that is a version of, we're assessing implicit biases to study racism. If you critique this, you're opposing our anti-racist efforts, and so you're an anti-racist, which is that is your, who would do this except a racist, right?
Yeah.
And so that
why
is
why is this so important to you?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Why? Well, it's more than just why it's so important. You're saying, you're criticizing it, so you're doing anti-racism. So and two negatives is a positive. I mean, it's this very simplistic thing, but that was what happened, and so it was very very difficult for people to publish critiques in the 2000s and 2010s. But some did get published. And, they'd get published and then they'd be, supposedly refuted. There'd be more refutations than there would be critiques. But the critiques didn't go away because the problems they identified were real. And starting around 2015 or so, more and more critical, skeptical stuff about implicit bias in the IAT in particular started to get published. So that's like almost 20 years from when the stuff first came on, that this sprouting of, really thoughtful, scientific, methodological, statistical critique. Okay, that's the lay of the land. Your question was, what are the claims? So the original claims, circa 1998, 2000, 2005, this is the era before there was much in the way of critique. It's the era where the critiques were dismissed as just racist and nobody needs to pay attention to it. So that's when the implicit bias began to got a lot of scientific traction and then even public traction. It was Hillary Clinton referred to it in her 2016 campaign, that we need to, I don't remember the exact quote, but that there was some condemnation of implicit bias. Okay. The claims were things like 70 to 90% of Americans are unconscious racists. That the IAT captures something different than explicit measures of prejudice. So an explicit measure is just a questionnaire measure. So like one of the most common questionnaire measures for prejudice is to ask people to rate any group on what's called a feeling thermometer. Might go from 0 to 10 or 0 to 100. It's a temperature. So the higher the temperature, the warmer you feel to the group. That turns out to be a very, very good assessment of explicit prejudice that does a very good job of predicting discrimination, actually. So saying the critique of implicit bias is different than saying, oh, well, prejudice and discrimination are dead. Implicit bias can be a kind of methodological and scientific borderline, and maybe more than borderline, disaster area. That can be true, and there still could be prejudice and discrimination. This is the method is bad. Yeah. So anyway, 70 to 90% of Americans are unconscious racists. The implicit measures, IAT, there's others besides the IAT, capture something very different than explicit measures and really strongly predict things like discrimination, and that real world gaps are a function of implicit bias to some degree. So those were the common claims. And I think that in part, to the extent that institutions were sincerely motivated, which I'm slowing down here because I don't know how much they were sincerely motivated to do something about this. There's a paper just came out, which I've only read the abstract, that much of the push for implicit bias trainings was by elite white liberals. And it seemed to be serving like a social signaling mechanism, much more than a let's actually do something about racism mechanism. So that's why I'm hesitating. But to the extent that it was sincere, which is, for some people, it probably was to some degree sincere. If you believed the original rhetoric around implicit bias, if you believe that, 80% of Americans are unconscious racists, and that this is, really a powerful predictor of their discrimination, you might come to believe that, well, one way to address this is to bring this unconscious bigotry to consciousness so that at least the well-intended people could do something about it. I think that's to the extent that it was earnest and not just like this virtue signaling on the part of elites, that would be the logic. But that logic has several problems. One, I'm laughing because you can't make this up. It's now over 10 years ago. It's 2014. Paper comes out finding, so this is the first, in 2014, they probably did the research in 2012 or 2013. These were the first people to test whether what's assessed by the implicit association test is unconscious. It's just by assumption. It's sort of like the stereotype inaccuracy stuff. It's just they have this test and they assume it's unconscious. So they tested, they asked people, they told people what the IIT was and asked people to predict their scores. Their predictions were massively accurate. Those correlations like 0.7 and higher. So people know, if people know what their IIT score is going to be, the idea that it's unconscious is kind of falsified. It's really pretty strongly falsified. So they're not unconscious.
Om drömmar har en hemstad så heter den VM i fotboll. Sverige är nu en del av denna dröm och miljoner blågula hjärtan slår i exakt samma takt. Ladda ner Expect-appen och förstärk din VM-upplevelse med vår helt nya sportbok. Som ny spelare får du även en matchad bonus på upp till 1500 kronor. Välkommen till nya Expect. Åldersgräns 18 år, se regler och villkor på expect.se.
Trippelt välkommen tillbaka säger vi till cheeseburgarnas cheeseburgare. Ja, vi pratar såklart om triple cheese på McDonald's. Lika god som vår cheeseburgare, fast trippelt. Bara på McDonald's.
Get ready Sweden. BetMGM är här. Nu kan du uppleva spänningen från Las Vegas i mobilen. Ta chansen att spela på Bellagio's roulettepool eller våra exklusiva MGM-slots. BetMGM. Casino och sport i mobilen. Åldersgräns 18 år. Regler och villkor gäller.
That's number one. And then all this stuff comes out showing that the scores themselves, IIT scores themselves are biased. So, again, without going into all the details, scores on the IIT range from negative to positive. So a negative score might be pro-black, a positive score might be pro-white, and the presumption was that 0 was egalitarian, right? It's sort of like, it's like a discrimination. It's a judgment task, but it's a sort of like discrimination. Okay. But IT is a reaction time task. People are categorizing stimuli into categories, and whether 0 actually corresponded to egalitarian behavior was never assessed. It could have been assessed because there were studies that gave the IIT and also assessed discriminatory behavior. So they could have identified through simple correlation analysis, really regression, but it's a fairly simple analysis. What is the point on the IIT that corresponded to the egalitarian behavior? They could have done that. Never occurred to anybody to do it. So around the time that the criticisms start picking up, around 2015 or so, one of them does this with like 3 or 4 papers and finds that rather than 0, the point of egalitarianism flips around from study to study and ranges in the positive range, like 0.3, 0.6, something like that. I mean, the average IIT effect, I don't know, is probably around 0.2 or 0.3. Again, what that means doesn't really, just some sort of, it's interpreted as pro-white bias. But what they're finding is scores 0.3 and above are corresponding to egalitarian behavior. So what that means, so the claims that 70 or 80 or 90% of Americans are unconscious racists was based on scores above 0. Scores above 0 are anti-black bias. But if 0 is not the cutoff for egalitarianism, all the 70, 80% claim is nonsense. It's the people above 0.3 or 0.4 or 0.6, which is going to be a lot lower than the people above 0. So the 80% of Americans are unconscious racists. That was nonsense also. And there's a paper that just came out like a month or two ago. And that was probably the single best paper on the IIT and discrimination that I've seen so far. It has a big team and it was an adversarial collaboration. So should I explain what that is, an adversarial collaboration?
People who are usually not the best of friends or agree on the basic assumptions.
That's right. That's right.
Political assumptions.
That's right. That's
but
right.
you could explain, but I wanted to be graded, apparently.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's basically right. It doesn't have to be political. It could be theoretical. There is an intersection of political and theoretical. This anti-racist stuff is both empirical and theoretical. It's a theory, how unconscious are IIT scores and how much does that predict bias and discrimination. That's a mini theory. It's not theory like theory of evolution or relativity, but it's like a mini theory of how racism works. And yes, to collaborate, there are two main ingredients. To have an adversarial collaboration, there need to be people who disagree, who have probably published opposing viewpoints on this issue. Right now, we're talking about the power and importance of implicit bias. So they would disagree about that, but they'd agree that this is subject to empirical test, and they'd agree to work together to provide the best tests of them. Okay. So that's what this group did. That's who this group was, and that's what this group did. They did a slew of studies, which I recently summarized as part of a talk. So they administered the IIT 4 different measures of behavioral discrimination, as well as explicit measures of prejudice. Like this. I don't remember exactly what they were, but they were just questions like the feeling thermometer that I just described.
Yeah, how much do you like this group?
Yeah.
How warmly do you feel towards these
yes,
people?
it was.
So you could correlate with the actual behavior.
That's right. Exactly. So here, I'm actually reading off my slide. So across the 4 measures, there was no anti-Black discrimination. Actually, on 3 of the measures, they had pro-Black discrimination. And 1, there was egalitarian. So that's the start. This was also a registered report. So what that means is that they had to lay out what they planned to do before they actually did it. And the journal that published it agreed to publish it based on their plans as to what they were going to do. And what's great about this is it ties researchers' hands. They can no longer make stuff up after the fact. Like, this was our standard. This is how we were going to test it. If the results were this way, it would mean this. If the results were that way, it would mean this. Okay, so I'm going to continue. So one of the things they did was they used both the implicit measures, which included things beyond the IIT as well, but they had several implicit measures, and the explicit measures, and they would use both to predict behavioral discrimination. Right, that could go either way, right? I mean, if it's a low enough measure, it could predict pro-Black discrimination, and if it's high enough, it would correspond to anti-Black discrimination. So by using all of those together, they could look at how much each predicts over and above the other. So how much do implicit measures predict over explicit ones? How much do explicit ones predict over implicit ones? And what they found is no matter how they did it, the explicit measures powerfully predicted discrimination. They're like 0.5, 0.6. These are high effect sizes. Whereas the implicit measures, the effect of the implicit measures when controlling for the explicit measures was on the threshold of trivial. So they had an effect size in advance that they said, okay, below this is trivial, above this is non-trivial. It was right at that threshold. It was right. Yeah. So I can't say it was below the threshold of trivial, but it was right at the threshold of trivial. That's the second thing. The explicit measures, maybe I said this, predicted discrimination far more than did the implicit measures, and that the 0 on the IIT corresponded to anti-white bias, not to egalitarian treatment. There were such a good study. There's more beyond that, but those would be the headlines. So you put all that together. So you're being subject to an implicit bias training, and at this point it's probably mostly nonsense, because it's probably not based on the most recent data. It's probably based on this stuff from the 90s and early 2000s, where because it takes a long time for that to percolate into the real world, and so they're probably covering all this stuff as if implicit bias is this powerful, pervasive, deeply predictive of discrimination, unconscious phenomena for which there's currently no evidence.
I mean, it also ties into like a view of people, or like people in our current times. I mean, if you have a view, I don't know, in the 1900s, at least sometime in the 1900s, that you could become a better person, that people are mostly rational and can make rational decisions. Now you have these sort of bias trainings, diversity training, and also I've been writing a lot about like racism and diversity in Sweden, and the training and the public discourse, or the discourse from the political and intellectual level. And there are mandatory courses that you have to go through, and you have to get like certified if you want to be a practitioner in a hospital, for example. And if you ask critical questions, as you said before, like if you ask the critical questions, then you're actually an anti, and that cancels both out. So you're an anti.
Yes. So now you're a pro-racist. You're for racism,
and you can be a misogynist, anti-trans.
Right.
Like it's
right.
even though you are like pro-trans, you could be like pro-trans in this way, like everybody has the right to decide for themselves, but you can still be critical of certain claims
Absolutely.
in the field. And it's the same goes for feminism or the gender sciences. Like you could be I myself, I'm probably on the extreme left on a global scale, but in Sweden, because you question sort of premises or doctrines, you become like an anti-feminist or you're like misogynist. Because you've been a researcher for long, and you're in these very contentious and fraught questions, and you're researching them. Like, do you agree that the view, it ties into like a view of people that you can't really trust yourself. You have to trust us to make we have to train you and you have to listen to us. Am I being too, I recently just listened to a podcast about 1984 by George Orwell. So maybe I'm making too much of it, but it seems like it ties into a view of human being.
Yeah, I don't think you're making too much of it. I mean, it's a little bit of a stretch, but it's a stretch I can get on board with. So I'm more familiar with the United States than other countries. I mean, I lived here my entire life, so if you go back 100 years, like part of the culture was that Americans have a can-do attitude. Right? That American know-how was a thing, right? And we were Americans. I wasn't even born yet, but Americans were proud of that. There were obstacles, and Americans could overcome it. And a kid who grows up poor can grow up to be president of the United States, which Lincoln actually did. Right?
Yeah.
So that was all part of the culture, and it seems gone. Like you don't hear that kind of thing anymore. It's sort of like you were talking about at the beginning of this podcast was, check your privilege. And so what is the whole privilege discourse is, it's not that somebody has accomplished something. It's that they have unearned advantages. And, they're not really mutually exclusive. I mean, maybe some of us do have unearned advantage to some degree. And yet you can also have accomplished something, that's worth accomplishing through, hard work and sweat and utilizing the skills that you have. They're not really mutually exclusive, but that can-do agency, people are capable of, in general, with lots of exceptions, figuring out right and wrong and the best way to do things. It's just gone from the cultural discourse. It's just gone.
Yeah, I find like your research, perhaps like the stereotype accuracy, it's sort of what you're saying is not like the guy in the proverbial guy in the bar. He's not correct about all of his biases, but you're basically saying that people aren't stupid. People can actually assess the world around them, and they get things wrong, but they get a lot of things right.
Right.
And,
yes, that's exactly right.
And also what you said now about this paper, like the new paper, like you have the implicit bias is sort of, that's trust the scientist that makes like a weird, like that's like a new version of a Rorschach test. So you have to trust the smart psychoanalyst to say that you interpreted this ink blot this way, and that means we put you in this retraining camp. Right. But what you also said is like the explicit bias, it had a large correlation.
Yeah.
But then people are actually, they are themselves like rating, and they are saying, so you basically what I find when I read you is like you're actually sort of I'm a little bit I've become a little bit tired of being told that I have so much like unconscious implicit stupidity, and it's like I have to go through like these training courses, or I have to be taught by people who know much more than me to understand the world. And when I read you, it feels like maybe I get a lot of, maybe as a little human being, I could actually get some things right.
Well, that's going to make my week. You know, that anyone has ever gotten that message from my stuff is just, it's like, damn, I pulled it off. I mean, because that's true. That absolutely underlies a lot of what I have done and written about. Not all of it, you know, because people aren't perfect. I have stuff on bias and stuff also. So, but that is an underlying theme, and I'm really glad that came across to you, actually.
That's great. Let's move into you wrote a piece on your Substack, Unsafe Science, and with the headline "We tried to warn you," and it's a discussion about basically, I mean, Trump and his administration has been going hard for the DEI programs and also for the universities, and it's been written a lot in Sweden. We love to write about it because we love to write that scientists are fleeing elite institutions to come to Sweden, and I'm not sure if it's true, and I'm not sure if they're coming. If they're gonna, if the people who are actually fleeing are the people we want, in that regard, yeah. But I mean, there's a sort of it's been like a similar discussions, but to a lesser degree also here. But basically, like you're not saying it like this, but you've been warning about this for a long time, and you've been writing about it for a long time, not just like the last 5 years or 10 years. You've been writing about it for much longer than that, and you've been you're not only been you've not been an old man yelling at clouds. You've actually you've actually done a lot of stuff, and you founded Heterodox Academy together with Jonathan Haidt, and started, and you've been writing academically. I'm gonna leave the question to you now. Like, what did you try to warn people about? Do you think it's the worry or the complaining now, or the criticism towards Trump? Is it correct, or is it misplaced, or yeah?
It's like, all of those things are true. It's both correct and misplaced. What we warned, and it wasn't only me. I mean, that we tried to warn you post actually goes back over 100 years. And of all things, it was the AAUP. So the AAUP is the American Association of University Professors. They are both a national organization, but also a union. So a lot of college, I don't know what proportion, but often professors are unionized. They're one of the big unions. The AAUP, like many modern unions, is now like an engine for progressive political activism, especially within academia. But it wasn't that 100 years ago. And it made in 1915 and then in the 1940s, it had two very, very good, nuanced statements about academic freedom and what's necessary, what academic freedom means, and what's necessary to protect it and keep it. And in the 1915 statement, it explicitly warned academics not to become an engine for partisan politics. Because if it becomes an engine for partisan politics, it invites intervention from the outside, and that intervention is likely to be far more destructive than any self-discipline academics would impose on themselves to avoid partisan politics. That's a reasonable paraphrase of what they wrote. Yeah. It's not a direct quote. And they 100 years later, that's where we are.
Sounds prophetic.
It was absolutely prophetic that academia is not only when I say academia, I'm most interested in, and I'm most speaking about, the 200 or 300 elite research scholarship producing institutions. So I'm not talking about every little community college or even necessarily every small, barely struggling to survive liberal arts college. There's teaching issues there, but it's the ones that produce the knowledge, the ideas that get sort of diffused through the wider culture, like implicit bias. Implicit bias didn't come out of a community college. It came out of one of these 200 elite research universities. The two originators, the two most widely published, famous originators, one is at Harvard and the other was at University of Washington. So, these aren't coming out of Podunk College. So anyway, those institutions are overwhelmingly populated by faculty on the left. I mean, it's like, there's different ways to assess this. It's like political party membership, there's political party contributions, there's self-reported ideology. It doesn't matter how you do it. And when I say overwhelmingly, depending on the survey and the criteria, maybe 70 to 95%, it also varies by field to some degree, identify as some form of left. There's another 10 or 20% in the middle. There's maybe 5 to 10% at the most who would identify on the right. It's probably even less than that. And it's certainly less than that in social sciences and humanities, which are the fields that are most likely to deal with politicized topics. Not that the natural sciences don't. If you do climate science, that's become politicized. So there's some of that in the natural sciences, but not as much. And the political skew is worse in the social sciences and humanities than it is in the natural sciences. So there's a skew, but that doesn't mean necessarily what they produce is wrong, distorted, or unjustified. But empirically, in fact, a lot of what they produce is wrong, distorted, or unjustified. We've just talked about some of it. We've talked about the stereotype inaccuracy nonsense. We've talked about the implicit bias nonsense. If the fields were, even 40% people on the left and 25% people on the right and another, 25% in the middle, or whatever it would be, 30, I think there would have been enough people not on the left who would have reacted more skeptically to these now debunked claims that have emerged from the academic left. That would have made it, those criticisms would have been trenchant. I mean, the few that have gotten in have been trenchant, but if there were 5 times as many people, there would have been at least 3 or 4 times as many of these criticisms. It would have been real. The problems would have been realized earlier. The nonsense would have been debunked earlier, and the fields on these politicized topics would have proceeded more effectively. Okay, so that's like the scientific part. But instead, academia, the real world, here now, the American academia is largely, it's not largely good. Much of it, majority, probably not a majority, but a lot of it is an engine for progressive politics. And so what we've been, the AAUP warned about this 100 years ago. I've been warning about it for like 15 years. And, in at least 2 or 3 publications, I'm doing paraphrasing this. I wrote something like, if Republicans eventually figure out what's going on, what they are likely to do is to defund these fields, and sure enough, Trump comes in and he's like defunding. The word is that I don't know the status of this plan, but they were going to completely eliminate the social and behavioral science wing of the National Science Foundation. So I don't know the status of that. If they mean it, maybe it's done already. If it's done, if they're going to do it, that's it. There's no funding for social and behavioral science. Now, maybe you can wing it if, you hook up with a biomed researcher and you do, psychology and health or something like that. There might be some funding. But straight up funding for things like implicit bias, stereotypes and prejudice, or even romantic relationships, basic political attitude work in social, if they cut that, there are other potential sources of funding, but none of that will be coming from NSF.
And
so here we are.
Yeah.
We warned it. It's like, well, what did you think was going to happen? There's 2 kinds of political activism in scholarship. This blatant political activism, where they say quite forthrightly that, the purpose of my field, my discipline, this effort is to change the world. Well, that's political activism. There's nothing to argue about. You said that's what you want to do. Well, if people don't like the way you're changing the world, they're gonna do everything they can to oppose you. And if they control the government, that includes, cutting the purse strings. So that's explicit. And then often they don't say it explicitly. Originators of the IAT didn't say, well, we're doing this to change the world. At least not right away. Although within 10 years, they were publishing things in law journals about how the law needs to change. So it's very, very clear that that was also an engine for progressive political activism. And so what did you think was going to happen? Did you think that you would be allowed to do this forever? This is how the government works. People elect representatives to do the things they want. They don't want what you're offering. Why should they fund you? Like this it seems so obvious to me. It's amazing to me that it didn't happen sooner.
Yeah. I'm a huge fan of academic freedom, and it sounds like basically like saying I don't like racism. Basically, it should be self-explanatory, like to say that. But I like you recently wrote about what you brought up, like adversarial collaboration, and that they usually produce findings that require walking back social justice narratives. And we just talked about implicit bias, But those kinds of adversarial collaborations are, of course, much harder if you can't find any like adversary, which is an academic. Like, so if you have 90% basically, or maybe 70% on the left, more left-leaning, and you have 20% that's basically in the middle, but maybe that means just a little bit to the left. And then you have these few sort of dots of dissenters which with other perspectives. Then it's going to make the science worse. I also wanted to ask you, like, that's the we went into the I told you so thing, but also I'm a little bit sometimes I've seen my arguments quoted and used as an argument to like defund social sciences in Sweden or some gender science and I'm like, no, I don't want these subjects to disappear. I want them to be forced to be more rigorous and have external eyes. But I don't want... I'm not the judge of the evidence here. I can't. I'm not a scientist. So, but I see my arguments, and like you can easily... And
that's
maybe,
totally my argument. Same argument. It's the same idea. Right. I don't want... I mean, well, first of all, I haven't had a federal grant in a very long time. So, but I really don't want the fields defunded. However, I do recognize a credible threat of defunding as a potential motivator to upgrade academic standards. I am willing. So again, to me, Trump is just very superficial. He does things for flash. He doesn't do them. He does all sorts of things, not just the academic stuff. It's not coincident that he went after the Ivy League schools because they're big and flashy and everybody knows about them. That's what Trump does. So I have no confidence in the constructive value of much of what he's doing, except the fear of this sort of ham-handed attack on academia in general, the social sciences in particular, has some potential to put the fear of these continuing attacks, the sustained attacks on academia in ways that can, and I think are, motivating some reforms. There are reform efforts and noises and even policies and practices over the last 2 or 3 years that I never thought I would see. Drop in the bucket, total drop in the bucket. Academia is fundamentally the same as it was 10 years ago. It's very hard to change because of tenure and people's long-term jobs, which I'm not saying I'm opposing tenure either. That's a different discussion. But nonetheless, descriptively, once you get tenure, people can have the job for life unless they sexually harass somebody or do something grossly unethical. So that makes it very hard to genuinely reform academia, but there are bona fide efforts underway over the last few years that I never thought I would see. It remains to be seen how effective they're going to be, but I didn't think I'd see these sort of efforts. So I am convinced that Trump, for all his dysfunctional ham-handedness, he's probably having a mixed effect on academia because some of the direct things he's done are probably just outright bad, So I don't know the current status of it. But when the Trump administration first expunged diversity stuff, it was things like on biodiversity, things that had nothing to do with DEI. And, there might be, I remember reading reports on biomed studies that might have looked at different population differences, demographic differences in response to some treatment or levels of disease. So that was treated like DEI, because you're looking at group differences. And it's like I'm sort of inventing this now, but work on life-threatening conditions was defunded and stuff. So that's just bad. It's just there's nothing good about that. And yet this heavy-handed threat, I think, is also having positive effects on academia because it's motivating these efforts to reform. That's not mutually exclusive with it having these other bad effects.
Thank you, Lee Jussim, for being part of Rak Höger.
It's been a pleasure.
Och stort tack till er som lyssnar. Och detta är alltså en del av en större publikation på Substack med samma namn som podden. Du hittar allt material på www.enrakhoger.se. Och om du prenumererar där så får du varje vecka nya avsnitt av poddarna Rak Höger med Ivar Arpi och Under all kritik som jag gör ihop med Anna-Karin Windhamn. Dessutom så får du varje ny text som publiceras direkt i din mailkorg. Och vi får inget pressstöd, vi tar inte emot pengar från någon intresseorganisation eller lobbygrupp. Det är endast tack vare er prenumeranter som vi kan fortsätta vara självständiga röster i en konform samtid. Så stort tack för att ni är med. Utan er hade inget av detta varit möjligt. Och blir ni betalande prenumeranter idag så får ni 40% rabatt. Gå då in på www.enrakhoger.se/podd för att ta del av erbjudandet. Glöm inte att skriva enrakhoger.se/podd. Vi hörs nästa avsnitt igen. Och där tog det stopp. Ja, Ivar Arpi här igen. Om du vill höra resten av den här podden så måste du vara prenumerant på Kvartal, som jag nu har blivit en del av. Om du redan är prenumerant på min Substack rak höger så blir du nu automatiskt prenumerant på Kvartal och kan logga in i Kvartals app med din mailadress. Så kolla din mail för mer information. Men om du inte ännu är prenumerant på rak höger eller Kvartal så kan du testa att bli det i en månad helt gratis på kvartal.se/testa Ivar. Så för att testa mig, mina poddar, mina texter och resten av Kvartals texter och poddar gratis första månaden, gå till kvartal.se/testa Ivar så kan du börja med att höra resten av den här podden.